The House of Drear, Chapter 18, Part 1. It seemed to Thomas as though they had waited for hours. He couldn't see a foot in front of him where he lay in the trees surrounding the clearing. He was not to talk, nor could he move very much. This scaring of the Darrows wasn't at all like he had imagined it earlier when it was still day. Now he was chilled through to the bone, lying low on his stomach in the pitch-black night. He couldn't see his father where he, too, lay in wait a short distance away. He couldn't see Mayhew or Mr. Pluto, nor hear them either. All was so silent, so mysterious. He had to clench his fists to keep his teeth from chattering. Why don't they come, he thought. What are the Darrows waiting for? Thomas could feel small insects crawling over his ankles where the chains were locked. He wanted to sit up and slap the bugs, but he dared not. Don't you think of moving, Mayhew had warned him. They might wait in the trees for an hour or two just to make sure no one's around. If they spot us before they hit that clearing, the game will be over. Thomas heard the slightest movement. He buried his head in the pine needles. He had phosphorus tape over his eyebrows and around his eyes. The same tape outlined his jaw and cheekbones. He had to keep his head always down so as not to glow there in the weeds and bushes. He thought, I'm getting scared. I'm going to be just scared awful if one of them happens to step on me. Think about something else, he told himself. Think about today. Whatever sound Thomas had heard was no longer separate from the subtle sounds of night. Thomas let himself become full of the day and all the preparations they had made. They had run into the Darrows once, Mr. Small and Thomas, and it had been a tense meeting. It had happened after Thomas and Mr. Small returned from Columbus, where they spent a lot of Mayhew's money in the theater supply store. Never had Thomas been in such a place. There were costumes and masks, some of which they bought. There were trunks full of drapery material and shelves of cosmetic paints and dyes. There were whole stage sets with fake platters of food and crystal glasses painted to look as though they were filled with red wine. Mayhew had asked them to find gossamer wings, and they had been lucky to find a huge, feather-light pair which they purchased at a fair price. Thomas was still talking about the store when Mr. Small stopped the car downtown to do more shopping. They bought groceries and dishes to replace temporarily those which had been broken. When later they were coming out of the hardware store, their arms full of paint-mixing pails and such, they saw 3 of the Darrows coming toward them. Thomas stopped in his tracks. Keep yourself moving away from the car, Mr. Small had said out of the side of his mouth to Thomas. They had not bothered to cover up any of their purchases from the theater supply store. The Darrows appeared to be just as surprised to see Thomas and Mr. Small. One of them stopped in the street, looking around at the other 2, but the 2 biggest ones came on ahead. Mr. Small said good day to them in a matter-of-fact tone, since it was the custom always in a small town to speak to everyone. The Darrows looked hard at them, and then one said good day. He tried to smile and did manage a weak one. You be Mr. Small? The one Darrow had said. Thomas remembered it all. That's right, said Mr. Small. I don't believe I know your name. But the Darrow man wouldn't say who he was. He went on talking, not looking at Thomas or Mr. Small, but at the store wrapping paper that partially covered the paint pails and mixing sticks. Getting ready to paint things, Thomas couldn't help saying with a broad grin. Going to paint the whole inside of the house. Mr. Small had given him a sharp glance, telling him not to say anything else. Here you folks had some excitement over there in the big house, said another one of the Darrows to no one in particular. The Darrow who had spoken first looked maniacally at his brother. The Darrow who had spoken first looked menacingly at his brother. Mr. Small smiled at them. Oh, you mean old Pluto, he had said. Yes, he took real sick in the night. We had to bring him to Columbus, where there is a good doctor I know. We left him there with a colleague of mine, since he wouldn't go into the hospital. He has to have a thorough going over, but I suspect he will be coming back home tomorrow morning. Then Mr. Small avoided looking at them, giving the impression he was hiding something. Thomas began to hum significantly. The Darrows fidgeted nervously. That's all? One of them couldn't help asking. Why, what more could there be? Said Mr. Small. Everything has been so peaceful and quiet, even with Mr. Pluto becoming ill. And then he bid them good-bye. He and Thomas left the Darrow men gawking there in the middle of the street. Now Thomas grinned at the dark, his mouth pressed against pine needles. He opened and closed his hands resting at his sides, trying not to rattle the chains attached to his wrists.
By now he was cold and stiff in every muscle. He shivered from head to foot, for he wore only a flimsy tatter of a shirt and trousers that were mostly rags. The fronts of both had been brushed with phosphorescent paint. He still lay in the position Mayhew had placed him a few hours before to hide the glow of his clothing. I can't stand it much longer, he thought. I'm going to have to move in another 5 minutes. I can't help it. I just can't. Mr. Small, close by Thomas, was having similar thoughts. They had waited there maybe 4 hours. The time had to be well after midnight, and he wondered how Thomas was faring there, hidden in the weeds and bushes. He won't be able to stay still much longer, Mr. Small thought. He must be cold with so little on. We'll be at the doctor's before this is over. Mr. Small was dressed much like Thomas, in tatters and rags, with chains about his wrists and ankles. The chains were real and quite heavy. Mr. Small hugged the ground in the way Thomas did. During the long period of time he lay there, he began to feel as though he were a slave, hiding and running. Somewhere in the back of his mind was emptiness and fear, loneliness the way a desperate slave would feel. At the same time, Mr. Small felt slightly ridiculous. The whole business of the night, having to lie so still, hardly breathing, was a bit mad. But Mayhew Skinner had a way of making the unreal and the unaccustomed seem normal. He's a magician, pure and simple, thought Mr. Small. I wouldn't have believed a week ago that anyone could get me out here, catching pneumonia just to perform an elaborate joke. What have we come to, acting like fools? But Mayhew had his mind on something entirely different. For one thing, he was burning hot. He could feel perspiration trickling down his neck and to his shoulders, then down his arms. He, too, lay on his stomach, hidden by trees and grass and bushes. He was dressed in a heavy, odd-fitting, old-fashioned suit. He wore a long, blondish wig streaked with white, which fell to his shoulders. The wig had been treated with a phosphorus spray paint, and the effect of it in the dark, when he removed his hat, was spectacular. His face and neck were covered by a cream-colored mask, fitting over his skull under the wig. Never had he imagined that one day he would play the part of a white abolitionist. He didn't find the prospect funny at all, however. He would play his role with all the grim skill he had. He fully intended to be the most superb apparition of all. Slowly Mayhew lifted his head about an inch, just high enough for his eyes to scan the top of his father's cave across the clearing. Directly above the wood doors in the cave mouth, hidden there among the trees, was Pesty. Poor baby, he thought. Has she fallen asleep? I should have my head examined for letting her stay out here. They'll become suspicious. He had tried to provide an alibi for Pesty staying out this late. It was in his best feminine hand he had written to Mr. Darrow and had allowed Pesty to deliver the note saying that the child wished to stay in the big house until Mr. Pluto returned. The child was unusually upset over Mr. Pluto's sudden illness, the note said, and the Smalls would be pleased to have her stay the night if Mr. Darrow did not object. Darrow had not replied, and Pesty had come anyway, since she always went where she wished and returned home when she felt like it. If she falls asleep or sunk, thought Matthew. Lying the way they were, facing the clearing and the cave, neither Mr. Small nor Thomas, nor Mayhew either, had any way of knowing if the Darrows were creeping about among them. Pesty was to watch for them and give the signal because, being the kind of child she was, she knew enough about night and Darrows to know when they were moving. Then Mayhew heard it. Just a soft sound it was, like a bird giving its last weak chirp before sleep overcame it. The sound came from above the cave. It was Pesty's signal. Mayhew grinned uncontrollably. Come on, Darrow, come on in. Mr. Pluto was calm and comfortable. He sat within the cave tunnel just beyond the partly opened plank doors in the cave mouth. He rested in a cushioned chair Mayhew had provided for him. Wrapped snugly around his shoulders was his heavy brown throw. Upon his head was his black stovepipe hat. He played no man but himself, and he was the same as always, except for Mayhew's warm hide gloves on his hands and a wool blanket bunched around his legs. Pluto could see the whole clearing and the trees surrounding it, without being seen himself, but he couldn't see Thomas or Mr. Small or Mayhew. He had stared at the clearing and trees for hours. He knew the three of them lay out there, but, after a time, he began to think maybe they'd gone and left him. Maybe they had tricked him, and an ambulance would burst suddenly into that clearing and take him away. Halfway through the waiting, the staring, he became afraid. The night settled around him. The minutes hung inside him in even lengths of cold. He felt his mind getting further away from him. He became frightened that he might see the real ghosts of old Mr. Drear and the two slaves, as he had seen them before when he was sick and tired with despair. There had been a time when what he saw was just the Darrows walking stealthily behind him, never too near and never too far away. They had followed him down the years, as had those ghosts, so that oftentimes he couldn't tell which he was seeing. But now his mind settled back. He had caught hold of one thought he had tried earlier to fix in his mind. He could even doze off now and again, sitting in the chair with his chin resting in his beard. But always that one idea stayed close to his ear, that much of his mind was alert and ready.